So what I'm going to do is talk to you about the stand at the back of the neck and how to draft these different collars. And I'm going to call this a Peter Pan collar because it's drafted the same way. A traditional Peter Pan collar, of course, has the rounded corners at the edge, but that doesn't mean you have to have rounded corners. Let's say we're going to make a very wide collar, but we want it to lay close to the body. Then I would have it overlapped 1/2 of an inch. And you can make that collar very wide. It can come all the way out to the shoulders. So let me pin this down. This is going to have to change in a moment. And put this here and this down here so I have some room to work. And remember, when we overlap, the neck at the shoulder touches. It does not overlap. Otherwise, it would make the neckline too short. So to draft a wide collar that only lifts a tiny bit over the seam allowance, oh, they shifted. Too bad. Okay, here we go. I can put that back easily. There. All right, there is my overlap, 1/2 of an inch. So you trace the back, the center back, and I'm going to put a dot where the shoulder is, and that I always like to do in red because that eventually will work its way into the seam allowance, becoming our notch. I also want to show you about, this is center front, and you want the collar to curl at center front. So what you'll do is you come down the neckline 1/2 of an inch. That's a good 1/2 inch. Then also turn of cloth, the collar sits on top of the fabric, so I'm going to move it up 1/4 of an inch. You can see where the natural neckline is. I'm going to go up, 1/8 of an inch at center back, blending it back in before it reaches the shoulder. And then from about mid neckline, it will droop down. It will actually follow down this curve. Okay? And as I mentioned, this can be a very wide collar. This could easily be 4 inches. Let's do a 4-inch one. This gets blended right here. You don't want a little bump there. I'll even do a little point. Now, you can see this. This is the extension for buttons and buttonholes. The collar comes to center front. We haven't overlapped the neck at all, so these measurements are good. So let's say we're going to make a point. Whoops. Got a little short there. Okay, so, and then this is basically our collar and center back. Now let me take this off. So this is our center back of the collar. This is also the straight grain. Now I'm not adding seam allowance on anything at this point. Okay? Center back falls on the straight grain, and the cross grain is perpendicular to center back. All right, now as a sample, I've already made one. Pull this out of the way. This is the pattern. Center front, it goes down the 1/2 inch, up in the back. This is the point. And I will put some of these on a dress form in a few minutes and show you. I've added seam allowance right here so I can pin it to the dress form. But this is it. No seam allowance except here. This is it, and it will lay flat on the body, but by lifting it the 1/8 of an inch, it helps roll over the seam allowance a little bit. And by cutting the center front down some, when we pick that up, it helps this curl, which you'll see in a few minutes. All right, so that's the 1/2 inch overlap for a flat collar. Now, I'm going to orient these this way this time because this will make a little more sense since I'm cutting the straight of grain down center back. So now I'm going to overlap this 2 inches for a 1/2 inch stand. That means at the back of the neck, it lifts 1/2 of an inch. So the next touch, and this is with the full shoulder. In Tien's or the blue blouse, I cut the neckline away, so it's a little bit different. This overlaps 2 inches right there. Secure these down. This collar can't be as long as the flat collar. It has to be a little bit shorter, like 3.5 inches, because what's happening is it's going to lift up. And as the more it lifts, if it falls too far on the body, it'll just crunch up. It won't act like a collar. So now this neck measurement is correct. We haven't overlapped. However, we've got this bump, and the more we overlap, the more this bump is going to get bigger and bigger. So we have to make sure that when we draft this pattern, we capture the back neck measurement and the front neck measurement. So what I'm going to do is dot this a little, come up my 1/8 of an inch. I'm pretty good with my eyes, so I'm not even going to use a tool yet. Okay, and then actually we need a tool here because of this bump. This I will go down about 3/8 of an inch. So 3/8 of an inch is here. Bring that up to center, to the mid of the neck. These two must blend. I usually do it by eye first. There it is. However, this was 3 3/4 in the back, so I'm going to measure that. From here, this is where the shoulder lines intersect, 3 3/4. So actually, look where that goes. That is too small. So for 3 3/4, I have to capture that measurement. If I don't, the collar will not fit. So here we go. See, we're extending it that much. That's about 3/16 of an inch. Yep, 3/16 for sure. This is up that 1/8 of an inch, so that's up 1/8 of an inch from there. And this collar could be about 3.5 inches. So let's say 3.5 inches. And I also have to check the front neck measurement, which is 4 3/8. So let's measure that, 4 3/8. And this comes to a little bit more than 4 1/2 to center front. So I'm going to make the collar to there. This from here to here is about 4 3/8. You always can have an extra 1/8 in for ease. It does sometimes help the fabric sit on top, the collar sit on top of the body. And I will talk to you about that in a minute. So I'm doing these in points just to show you that this is a Peter Pan draft, but it does not have to be rounded. So this would be my collar. Okay, and this is the back, center back right here. We extended it again to capture the full measurement of the center back. This is the shoulder intersection, so that will also be the notch in the seam allowance. And I have a sample of that to show you as well. This is it. So this is the collar. And there you have it. Okay? Now you can start to see how these are shaped differently. Let me put this here. This is the partial stand. This one was overlapped 2 inches. This is the flat collar. Whoops. And you can see how the shapes are starting to change. I'll put the seam allowances on top. So I'm matching center back neck and seam allowances. All right, now another one. We'll do a 3-inch overlap, which will give us a 3/4 inch lift in the back. And I think you're starting to get the idea. I won't draft that one. I will simply show you the pattern. You see the big dot, and let me explain this. This is very important. Now that we have a big overlap here of the 2 patterns, we have to make sure that we place our notch in the correct area. So this, I already dotted it here. Yep, I have a little red dot right here. That would be where the shoulders meet. And because you're drafting, you lay your paper over and draft, you want to find the middle of the overlap. You could even do it with pencil and then erase it. So maybe, let's see, if I put this here, and this is dropped at the center neck 3/8 of an inch as well, then, oops, there it is. When I'm blending this point off, you want to look at the overlap of the shoulder areas here and find the dead center of it. That will be your notch. And this one got extended too, a little bit to capture the back neck measurement. So from this notch to center back is the same measurement as the sloper, and from here to center front is the same as the sloper. So once again, look at the difference in the shapes as I do these. See how they're more and more flat. And the more and more flat, what happens is this outside measurement forces the collar to go up onto the neck and create the stand. And the last one I'm going to do is the 4-inch overlap, and that will give you a 1 inch at the center back stand. And I will draft that one as well to show you. So here we go. I'm going to put this here. Take another piece of paper. And this one will have the narrowest of the collars. You can go up to about 2 3/4 of an inch on this because it lifts up the back and comes down. And if it's too long, unless it's patterned very specifically, it will just bunch up around the neck. So I'll give you a rough draft on this one. This one also will come down about 3/8 to 1/4 of an inch at center front, and up in the back the 1/8 of an inch. I'm going to mark this, but we'll see how far out we have to go. Blend it back in around these, and in the middle of this V where the shoulders are overlapped, that's going to be my shoulder notch. So once again, I have to measure the neckline. So 3 3/4 for the back. I'll start with my 3 3/4 on the red line and move around the back of the neck. And this is it right there. So that comes out pretty far. And then 4 3/8 for the front. And that's dead center right there. So we're in good shape there. And as I mentioned, this collar can only be about 2 3/8 because it's going to lift, or 2 1/2 because it's going to lift 1 inch, which gives it about another 1 3/4 for the fall, what they call the fall. So let's do 2 3/4. It will take that. And here's the back neck, back of the collar, etc. I'm doing a rough draft because I do have one prepared to show you. And then your point can be whatever it wants to be, whatever you want it to be. This, of course, I dropped this the 3/8 of an inch. Let's say I want it to be a scallop. You can do a scallop. No reason why you can't. Whatever shape you want it to be. It's still basically the same thing as the Peter Pan plot. And let me show you what this is. And here you go. This is it with a 1 inch stand. And I do have seam allowance. And there it is. There it is. Okay? Now, what I also want to do is show you how to prepare the entire pattern piece. Not with seam allowance, perhaps, but at least as far as upper collar, under collar. We'll put this here. And once again, there you go. The different shapes. So this is a good reference for you to look at. These are the ones that I did. You blend the neckline at the shoulder and you check the neckline measurements. You lower the center front 1/4 of an inch to 1/2 an inch for normal collars, and that pulls the center front up into shape, and raise the center back the 1/8 to accommodate the turn of cloth. Also, when you start working with heavier fabrics, it's a really good idea to add a little bit of the neck measurement. In other words, add to the neck measurement while drafting or for drafting the collar, because the collar does sit on the outside of the fabric. So if I'm using a very thick wool, for instance, to create a collar, I'm going to want that collar to be a little bit bigger than the neckline, so it fits on top of that fabric. Okay. This will be my center back line. And let's see where I'll put a cross grain. Created the center back line, oops, my cross grain, and I'm going to pin through the cross grains. I folded it so they're right on top of each other. Hopefully I allowed the correct amount of paper. Yep. I'm going to use this as my under collar and make my upper collar a little bit larger. The reason is, if you use this as the upper collar, it will shrink a tiny bit with the turn of cloth at the seam allowances. So if you remember, I like to put 1/4 of an inch seam allowance on my collars, just because, or 3/8. That way you don't have to go back and trim it later. So I dot everything. Normally I do this with a really fine pencil at home. However, I have learned that the camera doesn't pick that up. So 1/4 of an inch and 1/4 of an inch. Blend it with your tool before cutting it out. Right angle right here, both sides. And my notch is right here, so I'm going to put that at a right angle into the seam allowance. Also, whoops, didn't get that one, did I? Let's do it this way. So I have a 1/4 of an inch seam allowance, and I also have a right angle there. All right. Always a notch at center back and at center front. Now, with all this wide angle, I usually put several notches. That way I'm positive I'm going to get my collar sewn on without it warping. Okay, so this is my under collar. Now I'm going to show you how to make the upper collar. But I think what I'll do is start again with this under collar. So this will be under collar. Cut 1. Put this aside for a moment and show you how I will do the upper collar. Oops. Oh my, there you go. Oops, looky there. To be sure to get the cross grains perfect. I may have to go back and redraw that center back line. We'll see. But the cross grains must be on top of each other when you pin this paper together, or the pattern will not be on grain. Okay, so pin this down. Collars and sleeves are a couple of my favorite things because there are so many little details that can make your garment so unusual and really fun to create. A lot of problem solving. Okay, now remember, this particular pattern piece is what we call net, which means no seam allowance. This is the under collar, and I should write under collar on this one. Okay, so if you remember, we grow the upper collar. I do not need to grow it in the front of the neck, but I'm going to grow it a little bit more in the back because that seam allowance turns over. So I'm going to grow it another 1/8 of an inch at the center back, blending in to the side seam. And that's my notch right here. This is where, or I should have said shoulder notch. That will be my shoulder notch. And then I'm going to trace the front exactly as it is. Now for turn of cloth and for the collar to form as nicely as we want it to, the upper collar needs to be bigger. And I make it bigger at the bottom of the collar and this area to 0 here. So this would be like a cotton or linen, which I've done. The blue blouse and the green blouse are cotton and linen. Those are lightweight to medium fabrics. So I'm going to grow this out about an 1/8 to 3/16. About, I'm going to say an 1/8 of an inch. 0 here and an 1/8 here. Okay, 0, and this is where the pattern stops, and there's an 1/8. Then I'm going to grow it about an 1/8 of an inch all the way around. As I get into bigger or heavier fabrics, like woolens or even cottons can be very heavy, then I would grow it more. I have grown the upper collar as much as probably 5/8 of an inch at times when I'm working with a very thick fabric. So I hope you can see the first edge. This is the under collar, and I'm growing this out. Okay, that's good. And then add my seam allowance, 1/4 of an inch. Let's see there, 3/8 of an inch. Blend it all together. There's a right angle here at center back. Needs to be a little bit rounder right there. There. Cut it out while it's pinned together. Be sure to get scissors or straight pins out of the way of those scissors. I have certainly damaged many blades in the past. Tracing paper is really nice to work with because of being able to see through it. It's easy to transfer things. So here we go. That's going to be good. All right. Transfer this notch. We have a center front notch. And then this pattern I need to cut, and I can compare them. I can show you what they will look like. Yeah. This one I didn't dot the seam allowance, so I'm going to do that. And then just dot it, and it just is a good reminder. And I always write 1/4 inch, 1/4 inch. Okay, this is under collar, this is upper collar. show you how to transfer the notches from the body. Okay, so center back, center back. Line up your center backs. Correct? Then I can see through the paper where the notches are. Flip this one over. Fill them in. I can fill this in later, but this is the upper collar. It's cut one and interface. This is what you interface. You interface the upper collar because it helps pad the seam allowances so you don't see the seam allowances when you're wearing the garment. Now let's take a look at these two together. The under collar, I'll put it on top of the upper collar so you can see how they vary. There we go. Undercollar. You can see that the upper collar extends a little bit here and all the way around. The notches will match. Oh, I have to transfer this notch. So let me do that. To do that on this one, all I really need to do is align the center backs and transfer it this way. There it is. And now we have upper collar, which is underneath, and the under collar, and you have some variations on the collar. Hopefully this will help you to design and execute the style that you want. Now let's take a look at a couple of these on the dress form. Here I have the flat roll collar, the widest one. This is the one where you have about 1/8 of an inch lift in the back, and you've overlapped the shoulders 1/2 of an inch. So you can make this very, very wide. And you see how it's lifting right here? It's got a little, what I call attitude for a collar. That's because I drafted it 1/2 an inch below the pattern and pulled it up. Now let me show you what happens if I take one of these pins out. See how it's flat? And then when you lift it back up, it's going to create this little roll out of the front. And you can see the back. It just is barely coming out, and that's just enough to lift over the seam allowance. So now I'm going to compare this to the shortest one. The one that's about 2.5 inches that has a 1 inch stand in the back. Again, this one has the 1/8 inch stand in the back. This is the collar with a 1 inch stand in the back, and it was patterned by overlapping the shoulders at the outer edge 4 inches. Let's take a look at the back. First at the side. You see how this lifts, and the seam is right down here on the neck. So this is a complete inch lift before it falls, the fall, and down. So you can understand why you couldn't have a very wide collar with a 1-inch stand in the back unless it was patterned in a very specific way, and probably would have a separate collar stand inside. It would squish down on the shoulders and look bad. Now, let's also take a look at this lift. By cutting the pattern of the collar a little lower than the body at the center front and forcing it up, that's what creates this beautiful curve, this turn. I'm going to take one side out for you to see. This dropped down about 1/4 of an inch. So there's your about a quarter, that's just about 1/4 of an inch. This was dropped about 1/4 of an inch from the body of the pattern. And you can see the difference, the flat versus the curled. So now you have a better understanding of these patterns and how to do them. You can make more choices. The more you know, the more choices you can make. Now let's take a look at these side by side to compare them. If you liked this video, please subscribe, give us a thumbs up, and spread the word.